The loan officer slid the paper across his desk without ever looking at my face, and told me I had 48 hours. 48 hours to come up with money I didn't have, or Millbrook Trust and Savings would take my father's garage, the shop he'd built with his own 2 hands, the shop where his handwriting is still on the office door, the only thing my daughter and I have in this world. When I tried, again, to tell him I'd made every payment, that I could prove it, that the bank's own records were wrong, he sided me the way a man sighs at a fly and said, "Sir, this is not a negotiation." My 7-year-old, Poppy, sat in the chair beside me, swinging her legs, holding the folder of receipts we'd stayed up half the night organizing. With the whole world coming down on me, I remember thinking, I will not cry in front of her, I will not beg this man, and I will not let him watch me break. So I stood up and said, "I'll be back tomorrow." Then I walked out with my daughter's hand in mine. The next morning, I walked back into Millbrook Trust and Savings, and before that man's coffee had gone cold, I owned it. I'm going to tell you the whole story, how a mechanic who couldn't cover a mortgage payment ended up owning the very bank that was about to take his father's shop. It wasn't a lottery ticket, and it wasn't some rich stranger swooping in. What happened in those 48 hours was stranger and better, and all of it came out of a dented tin box on a shelf in my father's garage, and out of 31 years of a quiet man being decent to people who never forgot it. Before I get into it, here's the thing this whole ordeal taught me, because it's the spine of everything that follows: a man's real wealth is never in his bank account. It's in what he did for people when nobody was watching, and whether they'd stand beside him on the worst morning of his life. My father died believing he'd left me almost nothing. He'd actually left me the most valuable thing in that whole town. I'm a mechanic, not a talker, and I've never told this whole thing start to finish before, so I'll keep it moving. If you've ever sat across a desk from someone who had the power to ruin you and couldn't be bothered to hear you out, you already know exactly how that chair feels. Who we are. My name is Ezra Holt. I'm 39, and I run a 3-bay auto repair shop on the edge of a small town, on a gravel lot my father bought before I was born. His name was Silas Holt. He worked in that garage for 31 years, and he was the kind of man they don't make anymore. The kind who'd fix a widow's brakes and then somehow forget to send the bill, whose handshake was worth more than most men's contracts. He died 4 years ago and left me the shop, a mortgage on it, and, as far as either of us knew, nothing else. I'm a single father. My daughter, Poppy, is 7. Her mother and I split a few years back. I won't speak ill of her, and that's not this story. What is this story is that Poppy has been mine to raise every day since, and I've never thought of that as anything but the great luck of my life. She does her homework in the shop office after school. She has a tiny toolbox my father bought her when she was 3, before he passed, with her name painted on the lid in his handwriting. She helps, which mostly means handing me wrenches I didn't ask for. That garage isn't a building to us, it's my father's hands still working. It's the only room left in the world where I can still hear his voice. Money was always tight, and I want to be honest about that. A 3-bay shop in a small town makes nobody rich. I carried the mortgage my father had taken out and paid it on time every month for 4 years, some months instead of paying myself. There were stretches I ate like a college kid so the payment could go out on the first. I have never once in my life been late on a debt. My father was that way, and it stuck to me. Hold on to that fact, because it's the foundation of everything that follows. The machine breaks. About 6 months before that morning, something broke inside the bank's system. It started small, a letter claiming a payment hadn't been received. I called. I had the record right in front of me, the money gone from my account, the confirmation number in hand. The woman on the phone said she'd look into it. Then came a late fee. Then a letter saying the account was past due. Every time I called, I got a different person, told the same story from scratch, and every one of them promised to make a note. Nothing ever changed. Meanwhile, the fees multiplied like flies. A late fee generated interest, the interest generated another fee. Somewhere inside that institution my payment had been applied to the wrong line, and instead of one human being spending 5 minutes to check, the machine simply kept punishing me month after month for a mistake I never made. People who haven't lived through 6 months like that think it's a paperwork problem. It isn't, it's an erosion of your own grip on reality. You spend your lunch break on hold with a wrench still in your hand. You explain it to a stranger with no memory of the last stranger. You hear the same 3 phrases forever. I'll make a note. I'll escalate that. You should see it reflected in 30 days. 30 days later, a bigger number arrives instead. You start keeping a notebook of dates and names, because you've realized nobody on their side is writing down your side. And the worst part isn't the money. It's that after 4 months of being politely disbelieved, some cowardly corner of you starts to wonder if you're the one who's wrong, even with the proof in your hand. That's what those places do. They don't fight you. They just wear the truth out of you. Buried in the mortgage my father signed at his kitchen table, in his careful hand, was a clause nobody reads and nobody explains. If the account fell into a certain kind of default, the bank could accelerate the loan and demand the whole balance at once, not the missed payment, everything. A sum I could no more produce than a moon rocket. A mistake that was never mine had, over 6 months of ignored calls, metastasized into a demand for the full balance, backed by the threat of taking my father's garage. The desk. That's how I ended up across from a loan officer named Mr. Draven, my daughter beside me, a folder of proof on my knees. I'll describe him fairly, because I've had a long time to think about him. He wasn't a monster. He was something more common, a man who decided who I was before I sat down. He looked at my work clothes, the grease worked into my knuckles that no scrubbing ever lifts, my kid in a hand-me-down coat, and filed me instantly under a heading he'd used 1,000 times, small man, can't pay, full of excuses. Once he'd filed me there, nothing I said could climb back out of that folder. That's the thing about being poor and right at the same time, nobody ever believes the second part. I laid it all out, statements showing the money leaving my account, confirmation numbers, 4 pages of a phone log with dates and names. Poppy and I had built that folder the night before at the kitchen table. She put the pages in order while I read the dates aloud, drawing careful little numbers in the corners, tongue between her teeth the way she does. Around 11 she'd asked if we were in trouble, and I told her no, sweetheart, we just have to show them they made a mistake. She nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable thing grown-ups do, and she carried the folder into the bank herself the next morning because she wanted to be the one holding it. She told me it looked very official. Mr. Draven pushed it back across the desk with 2 fingers without opening it. I asked him, please, just look. I asked him to check the payment against the date I had. I asked, very quietly, whether a single human being at that institution could review it. He said, sir, this is not a negotiation, and told me I had 48 hours. Here's the only part of that day I'm proud of, I didn't beg, and I didn't raise my voice, with a 7-year-old watching my every move. I gathered my papers, stood, and said, Mr. Draven, I've made every payment on this loan. I can prove it, and I will. I'll be back tomorrow. You have a good day. Then I took Poppy's hand and walked out. I made it to the sidewalk before the shaking started, not crying, shaking, the kind that comes up from under your ribs when your body understands something before your mind agrees to it. I stopped and pretended to check my keys until it passed, because she was looking up at me. The tin box. That night I went out to the garage looking for the deed, the original documents, anything with my father's signature that might prove the property was clean. He'd kept his papers in the loft above the second bay, in boxes I hadn't touched since he died, because grief has a way of keeping certain doors shut. I climbed up at midnight with a flashlight, Poppy asleep in the office chair below with her coat over her like a blanket. I hadn't been up in that loft since the week he died. I told myself there was never time, but that was a lie I'd been telling for 4 years. The truth is that a man's handwriting on a box of invoices will take the legs out from under you, and I hadn't been ready. That night I didn't have the luxury of not being ready. I found a coffee can of his sorted bolts, organized by size the way he organized everything, and lost 10 minutes just sitting with it. His pencil was still up there. A rag hung on a nail where he'd left it. Grief lies quiet for years and then comes up out of a box of old paperwork at midnight and takes you by the throat. Sitting there with my eyes stinging in the dark, I remember thinking, they are going to take this room from me. This room where he stood. After an hour of dust and old invoices, I found a dented, rusted tin box, the kind that used to hold candy, tucked under a coffee can of bolts. Inside were the deed, my parents' marriage certificate, a photograph of my mother, and folded in a yellowed envelope a stack of certificates I didn't recognize, printed on heavy stock with a scrolled border. All I could tell in that cold loft was that the name across the top of every one of them was the name of the bank about to take his garage in 31 hours. That alone raised the hair on my arms. Whatever else was true, my father and that bank were tangled together in some way nobody had ever told me about, and those papers had been sitting 8 feet above the spot on the concrete where he used to stand, the whole time. What nobody remembered. Here's what I didn't know, and what almost nobody in town remembered anymore: Millbrook Trust and Savings hadn't started as some faceless outfit. Generations back it had been founded by the people of that town. Farmers, merchants, working men who each put in what they had because no big bank would touch a place that small. It was theirs, originally, a community bank in the truest sense. Over the decades it grew and reorganized, the descendants of those founding families drifted and sold and moved on, and the whole memory of what it had been faded into the paneling. Long ago, when my father was just starting out in that garage, he'd kept the bank's founders' cars running year after year, rebuilding his engine twice. One hard winter, when the man couldn't pay in cash, he offered shares instead. My father, who cared nothing about finance and couldn't have told you what a share was for, took them because he liked the man and a debt was a debt. He did it again a few years later, and again. Over roughly a decade the founder settled his repair bills in paper, and my father put the paper in a tin box, forgot about it, and went back to fixing cars and forgetting to bill widows. He never mentioned it to me. Not once. I've thought about why, and I believe the answer is that to Silas Holt, that stack of certificates wasn't money, it was a receipt for a favor done for a friend. Not the kind of thing you bring up. I sat in that loft reading every one of them, twice, then went inside and did what arithmetic I could, which wasn't much. At 1:30 in the morning I called the one man I knew who'd understand what I was looking at, Gus, my father's oldest friend, 72, who'd worked the next bay over for 30 years and once sat on the town council. Gus drove over in his pajamas and studied the certificates a long time under the kitchen light. Then he said something I'll remember until I die. Ezra, do you know what's happening to that bank right now? I didn't. He told me. The bank was in trouble, not failing, but tired. The board was aging out. A block of ownership had quietly been up for sale for months, small holders drifting away, and word was a bigger outfit from the city was circling to swallow the whole thing. Nobody local had the appetite or the money to stop it. Shares were cheap and getting cheaper, ownership scattered into 100 small forgotten pieces. And sitting on my kitchen table, in a rusted tin box, was the single largest legacy block of Millbrook Trust and Savings anyone had seen in 50 years. Not enough, though, I want to be honest about that up front, because I hate stories where the math is a fairy tale. My father's shares weren't enough to control anything. Maybe a fifth of what was needed. What they were was a foundation. The biggest single piece anyone held, and, crucially, a legitimate legacy stake that earned the holder a seat at the table. I said, Gus, a fifth doesn't help me. I've got about 31 hours. And that's the moment the whole thing turned. Gus looked at me across the table and said, Boy, do you have any idea how many people in this town owe your father? I said something like, he never charged them, that's the problem. And Gus said, that's not the problem. That's the whole point. Get on the phone. The calls. We started at 2 in the morning. I want you to understand how insane that felt, a mechanic 30 hours from losing everything, waking people up to ask them to buy a bank. I felt like a lunatic. Gus didn't. It turned out he'd been waiting 30 years to see if a town like ours still had anything in it. The first call went to Miss Corinne, 84. My father had fixed her car free every year for 2 decades after her husband died, never once let her pay, always claimed the parts were leftovers, which they weren't. I got 2 sentences out before she cut me off. Ezra, what time is it? Never mind. Come to my house at 7. Then Denny, who runs the diner. When Denny's transmission failed one winter and nearly took the restaurant down with it, my father fixed it over a weekend and billed him for coffee. Denny said, how much do you need? It went on like that half the night. Men my father had taught to change their own oil so they'd never have to pay anybody, families whose cars he'd kept alive through bad years, a schoolteacher he'd driven to work for a month when her car died and she couldn't afford the repair, a man who told me at 3 in the morning that my father had fixed his truck in 1996 when he was out of work and never mentioned the bill again, and that he'd thought about it every year since. Not one person asked what the return would be. Not one asked how risky it was. What most of them asked, some version of the same question: is this the garage Walt built? Sorry, is this the garage Silas built? Every call cost me something. Pride is real, and I have plenty of it. Every time Gus handed me the phone, I felt like a beggar, a grown man calling people at 3 a.m. to say, in effect, my life is falling apart and I need your money. Twice I hung up before it even rang. What undid me was that not one person let me finish the humiliating part. I'd get halfway through the explanation and they'd cut in, not to say no, but to tell me a story I'd never heard about the night my father came out in the rain to get them off the shoulder of a highway, about the summer he kept a family's van running on parts he paid for himself, about how he never once in 31 years brought any of it up again. I sat at my kitchen table at 3 a.m. learning who my own father was from the people he'd helped. He'd never told me a single story. He'd have thought bringing it up was a way of asking to be repaid. And when I said yes to their help, they said, then tell me where to be. Morning. By dawn we had something I still don't quite believe, a list, commitments, mostly small, a few $100s here, someone's savings account there. Denny put up more than he should have. Gus emptied something he shouldn't have touched. Miss Corinne, it turned out, had inherited a handful of the same old certificates from her own husband, sitting worthless in a drawer in her mind, and she brought them to my kitchen table at 7 in a Ziploc bag. Then 2 more people showed up with certificates. Then a 4th. That's what nobody had understood about Millbrook Trust and Savings. Its ownership hadn't vanished, it had gone to sleep, scattered across 100 kitchen drawers in the same town it always belonged to, forgotten by everyone except the outsiders circling to buy it. We didn't need to raise a fortune. We needed to wake the town up and put its own bank back in its own hands. At 8, Gus made 2 more calls, one to a lawyer he'd known since high school, one to a board member who'd spent years trying to keep city buyers out. That second man listened 4 minutes and said the sentence that made it real: bring it in this morning. If you have what you say you have, we can execute today. And that's how, at 9 o'clock, 32 hours after a man told me this wasn't a negotiation, I walked back into Millbrook Trust and Savings. I didn't walk in alone. I want to describe that lobby, because I've never seen anything like it and never will again. There was Gus in a suit 40 years old. Miss Corinne with her Ziploc bag of certificates, purse held in both hands. Denny, who'd closed the diner on a Tuesday morning for the first time in 11 years, a sign on the door reading back later. Family business. 24 people from that town, most of them people whose cars my father had kept running, every one of them there because a man dead for years had once refused to send them a bill. And there was me, in my work clothes, grease under my nails, holding a dented tin box. I hadn't changed clothes. That was deliberate. I had a good shirt at home. Gus suggested I wear it. I thought about it and decided against it. Whatever was about to happen in that building was going to happen to a mechanic, not to a man dressed up as somebody the bank might respect. If a folder full of the truth wasn't enough coming from a man in work clothes, then owning the place wasn't going to fix what was actually broken. So I walked in with grease under my nails and my father's tin box under my arm, and everyone behind me came straight from their kitchens and shops and farms, and none of us looked like anybody who owns a bank. That's exactly the point. The people who own a small-town bank should look like the people who live in the small town. Mr. Draven looked up from his desk, saw me, and wore that small, tired contempt of a man watching a problem walk back into the room. He started to say the deadline hadn't changed, and then the bank's attorney came out from the back with the board member, walked past him without a glance, and shook my hand. I watched it land on his face in stages: irritation, then confusion at the attorney's deference, then a scrambling recalculation as he counted the people behind me and realized whatever was happening had no category he owned. Then it landed fully, and the color went out of him. He half rose from his chair. Here's what stayed with me: the man who couldn't look at my face for 1 second the day before now couldn't stop looking at it. Nothing about me had changed: same clothes, same hands, same folder, same truth inside it. The only thing that had changed was what he now believed I could do to him. That taught me more about how the world works than anything else in those 2 days. By late morning the paperwork moved fast, with Gus and the lawyer walking it through. Everyone who'd shown up got their piece recorded. Gus insisted on it, and so did I. Around 11:30, the lawyer turned to me and said, "Mr. Holt, congratulations. As of this morning, you're the majority holder." I had to sit down. Then I looked for my daughter. She was on a lobby chair between Miss Corinne and Denny, swinging her legs, holding the same folder she'd carried the day before, because she'd insisted on carrying it again. She didn't understand a word the lawyers had said. What she understood was that yesterday a man had made her father small, and today the whole town had walked in behind him. She gave me a small, uncertain wave, checking, the way kids do, whether the grown-up is okay. I thought about what she'd remember of those 2 days, which is the only thing I ever really think about, not the shares, not the paperwork. She's going to remember that her dad sat up straight while a man refused to look at him, said "I'll be back tomorrow," and came back with everybody. If she carries nothing else out of her childhood, I'd like her to carry that. I didn't feel triumphant, nobody believes that part when I tell it. I felt hollowed out. All I could think, sitting in that chair, was that my father had spent 31 years believing he was a man of no importance who had nothing to leave his son, and that without ever knowing it, he'd left me the only thing that could have saved his own garage. Not because he was clever, but because he was kind, over and over, for decades, to people who kept a rusty box on a shelf in his memory and never let go of what he'd done. He didn't leave me shares. He left me a town. If my father had left me a fortune in a bank account, I'd have paid Mr. Draven his money the second morning and driven home, and nothing would have changed. He'd still be him, and the next mechanic would still get 48 hours. But what my father actually left me couldn't be spent that way. It could only be spent by standing in front of the people he'd been good to and letting them decide what his life had been worth. And they decided. 24 of them before breakfast, out of savings they couldn't afford to touch. Money would have saved my garage. What he left me saved the whole street. What I did, and didn't do. Everyone wants to know what I did to Mr. Draven. I'll tell you, and some of you will be disappointed. I didn't fire him in the lobby. I didn't stand over that desk and enjoy myself, though God knows part of me wanted to, and I won't pretend I hadn't rehearsed a speech at 3 a.m. What I did was ask him, in front of the board, to open my folder. He opened it. His hands weren't steady. I watched him read 6 months of documentation in about 15 minutes, the same 15 minutes he could have spent any day in the previous half year and hadn't. I said, "Now check it against the bank's own records." They did. It took the rest of that day and half the next, and here's the ending, which I still can't say without something happening in my chest. I was right. The payment had been misapplied by their own system, sitting in their own files the entire time, waiting for anybody to open them. Every fee, every escalation, was the compounding consequence of an error the bank made and refused, for 6 months, to examine. There had been no default, ever. The acceleration had no basis at all. Then I did the thing I most needed my daughter to see me do. I did not use my new position to erase my debt. I want to be clear about that, because it's the only thing that made any of this worth something. The bank corrected its error and reversed what it had wrongly charged. That was justice, and I took it. But the mortgage my father signed was a real debt, honestly incurred, and I owed it. So I kept paying it, every month, on time, to the bank I now controlled, until it was paid off years later, in full, exactly the way Silas Holt would have. I didn't want my father's garage saved by a loophole. I wanted it saved because I'd been right, and because I paid what I owed. And I wanted Poppy to be able to say both those things about her father for the rest of her life. As for Draven, he answered for what he'd done through a proper process, and it wasn't my hand that fell. I found I had no appetite for it. I'd sat across from a man who decided my worth in a glance, and it had nearly destroyed me, and I discovered I didn't want to hand that feeling to anybody, not even him. I didn't need him ruined. I needed him to have opened the folder. So instead, I changed the bank. That's the part I'm actually proud of. The first policy we passed, a mechanic, a diner owner, and an 84-year-old widow sitting on a board, was simple, and Gus wrote it in one sentence: any customer who brings documentation disputing an error is entitled to an in-person review by a human being within 72 hours. No exceptions. No, the system says what the system says. Somebody opens the folder. I've watched it save 4 families since. For times someone walked in with a shoebox of receipts and was actually listened to, and 3 of those 4 times, the bank had been wrong. The buyers from the city went away. What stayed the same, and what didn't? That's the other thing that came out of that Tuesday, and around here people care about it more than they care about my garage. Millbrook Trust and Savings stayed Millbrooks. The loans made now are made by people who know whose barn burned, whose kid is finally straightening out, which farm has a bad year every 3rd year and always comes back. That's not sentiment. That's better information than any algorithm in the city has ever had about this town. Miss Corinne sits on the board and is, without question, the most feared person in the room, because she's known most of the borrowers since they were children and has never once been fooled by any of them. Those numbers keep me up at night, not because we caught them, but because of what they say about how many folders never get opened at every other bank in this country. Now let me tell you the honest part, the part one care about most, because I'd be doing you a disservice if I sent you away thinking this story is a promise. Most people don't have a tin box in the loft. That's the truth. Most of the time, the man in that chair with the folder is exactly as right as I was, and exactly as ignored, and nobody's father happened to fix a bank founder's car 40 years ago. 48 hours later, he loses the shop, or the house, or the car that gets him to work, not because he was wrong, but because being right doesn't matter when nobody will look. That's the real story of that desk, and it's playing out right now, today, in 100 branches. My ending isn't the ending. Mine is the freak accident. And here's something that surprises people, I'm angrier now than I was that morning. Because when you own the thing, you get to see the files. I've sat and read what 6 months of automated letters look like from the inside, and seen how easy, how genuinely, insultingly easy it would have been for one person to fix my life at any point in that half year. 5 minutes of somebody's attention, that's all it would have cost. And nobody spent it, not because they were cruel, but because nothing in that building was built to make anybody spend it. Owning a bank didn't make me feel like I'd won. It made me understand exactly how thin the thing was that nearly destroyed my family, and how many people are standing in front of that same thin thing right now with nobody behind them. So don't take from this that a miracle is coming. Take this instead, which is the only real, usable thing I have. First, keep your records. Every receipt, every confirmation number, every call with a date and a name. Be so boringly, thoroughly documented that when somebody finally opens the folder, the truth is undeniable. My documentation is what made the tin box mean anything at all. Without it, I'd have owned a bank and still been wrong. Second, don't give up on the first day. They're counting on you giving up on the first day. I was an hour from walking away, and the only reason I didn't was that a 7-year-old was watching me. Third, and this is the one I'd carve on the door if I could, be decent to people when there's nothing in it for you. My father never once did a favor as an investment. He gave away brake jobs, forgot bills, drove a schoolteacher to work for a month, and died thinking it had amounted to nothing, because you never get to see the ledger. But every one of those things was going into an account, and 30 years later, in the middle of the night, my phone started ringing with people who remembered. You won't be there to collect it. That's not the point. It gets collected anyway, sometimes by the people you love, long after you're gone. One more thing. That evening, after the papers were signed, I drove Poppy home. She was quiet a long while in the back seat, then said, "Daddy, at the bank you didn't yell." I said, "No, honey, I didn't." She said, "But you didn't cry, either." I looked at her in the mirror, this small person who'd spent 2 days watching her father hold his entire life together with a paper folder and a rusty tin box, and said, "No, baby. Sometimes you just tell the truth. And then you say it again the next day, and you don't stop." She thought about that a while, then asked whether Grandpa knew he owned part of the bank. I told her the truth. I don't think he ever thought about it once. Then why did he keep the papers? I had to pull the truck over, because I finally understood the answer, sitting on the shoulder of that road, 4 years too late to tell him. He kept them because they were from a friend, because a debt was a debt and a promise was a promise, and you don't throw away a man's word just because it never turned into money. My father's garage is still open. His handwriting is still on the office door. Poppy's little toolbox, her name painted on the lid, still sits on the shelf where he left it for her. And in my office, over the desk where I do the books, I've hung one single share certificate from that tin box, in a cheap frame, where customers can see it. They ask about it sometimes, and I tell them it's my father's, that he thought it was worthless, and that it bought back everything he ever built. Then I tell them what it actually was. A receipt for one man's decency, held for 40 years by a town that never forgot, and cashed on a Tuesday morning by every person he was ever kind to, all of them standing in a bank lobby at 9 o'clock, waiting to buy something back for a mechanic who was dead.